Have you ever planted something just for the sake of planting it? Or planted something knowing beforehand that it wasn't really even a vegetable that you use that often? Well, if you're anything like me, you're likely nodding your head right now. If you're new here, I'm Audrey from Audrey's Little Farm, and I help passion-driven people trailblaze their way to a more self-sufficient life filled with happiness, plants, and chickens. So right now, I'm in that stage of preparing for my spring garden, and I'm still harvesting vegetables from my fall garden. There are even a few cool season crops that are quick to mature that I'm going to try to get planted before the weather warms up even further. But today I came out to the garden to harvest a few veggies and take care of a few tasks, and I realized I have all of this cabbage growing and it's pretty much just going to waste. I specifically remember this last fall, walking through the nursery to get some vegetable plants, looking at a cabbage and telling myself not to buy cabbage because I knew I wouldn't use it often enough. But I bought it anyways, and here we are months later and I've only harvested one head of cabbage. So as I evaluate and take notes of how my fall garden grew, I am definitely going to take note of the fact that my cabbage plants grew really well, but that I did not use them like I intended to. That way this next year when I'm planning out my fall garden, I will be reminded to either not plant it at all, plant less of it, or to make a plan to make something such as sauerkraut so I use it all up. So if you aren't yet keeping good notes and records of your garden season after season, it is definitely something I recommend adding into your routine because it has been a complete game changer for me. Because as much as we'd like to hope that we'll remember everything that worked and that didn't, we just can't. But because there are so many variables when it comes to gardening, we have to really keep our own notes and records because what works for a friend may not really work for us. But if we keep track of everything we do and the results we get season after season, we will eventually have a goldmine of information that is completely our own. For example, in my last spring garden, spider mites completely infested my tomato plants. But what I noticed is that they only infested my heirloom tomato varieties and not my hybrid varieties. And so this upcoming spring garden, I'm going to still plant a few heirloom tomatoes, but I'm going to keep them separated by themselves and plant fewer of them. And then I'm going to plant way more hybrid varieties because those are what did really well this last year. And if I didn't keep note of that, in seasons to come, I may completely forget that spider mites were the reason why I quit growing heirloom varieties and I'd grow a ton of heirlooms again. And so having that information is so valuable. If you don't have your own good system for keeping gardening notes yet, my gardening planner here has a sheet for your tried and true varieties. And so you can keep note of all the varieties that have done really well for you in the past and the notes of why you liked them, such as they grew really well or they yielded a ton, or maybe they just tasted really good. And so it's really good to keep record of all the varieties that are your favorites. So you can look on this list and know these are the tried and true varieties for you. I also have a list of your seed inventory so you can keep track of all the plant varieties that you have, where the seeds came from, the dates so you can remember how old they are. So then as you go on each season to order new seeds, you can look back in your seed inventory and know what you currently have and what you might need more of, or maybe what's so old and needs to get thrown out, and so you can buy new seeds of that variety. It also has a plant wish list, and so you can write down the gardening season that you want those seeds for and what kind of varieties that you want. I was just looking last night through some of my seed catalogs and highlighting varieties that I knew I wanted to grow this spring, and so I'm going to make sure I add them to my wish list so that I keep track of those. It's nice having everything in one spot. It also has a planting and harvest tracker, and so this sheet is for you to write down the plant variety, the planting method, meaning did you transplant it, direct sow, or are you going to start your own seeds to transplant? And then you write down your planting dates, so what day you need to start the seeds by, what day you need to direct sow or transplant by, your actual planting date, and your expected harvest date. And that one is really important for root crops, especially like carrots. And so if they're ready to mature in 60 days and you forget about them and they get way too big, then they end up getting a little bit bitter. And so if you write down your actual planting date, you can just write down the date of your expected harvest, so you have a plan of when to go out into the garden and actually harvest. And then I have a sheet for garden care. And on this page, you would write down the gardening season you're in and the date, and then the tasks that you performed, such as when you fertilized, added compost, pruned, things like that. So then as you evaluate at the end of the gardening season, you can look back and see that you fertilized, and then if your plants did really great, you could look back and see that maybe it was because you fertilized. Or if your plants are growing really poorly one season, you may realize it's been over a year since you added compost. So keeping these notes is super important. My next sheet that I have is a garden evaluation sheet. And this is for at the end of each gardening season, you go through and you evaluate some specific things, such as, did that plant variety have pests or disease problems? How well did the plant grow? Did it yield good, and did it taste good? You might have a plant that grew really great, but you didn't like the taste of the plant, so you probably shouldn't grow that again in the future. Or maybe, like me, you had a specific tomato variety that had a really bad pest problem. Like my heirloom tomatoes had that spider mite problem. So I wrote down that my heirloom tomatoes had a problem with pests. And then I have a sheet for your garden layout. And so the point of this is so you can write down not really write down, but make a map of your garden. And so you can see behind me, I have all those gardening beds. And so on this layout sheet, I would write my directions, north, south, east, and west, and then draw out my gardening beds and name each one, garden bed A, B, C, D, etc. And then on this following page, I have planting records, and I would write, for example, the gardening season, fall of 2021. In planting bed A, I had peppers. In garden bed B, I had tomatoes and carrots. And so now for this upcoming season, I can do crop rotation and remember in garden bed A, I had these specific vegetables. And so now for the following season, I want to switch that and put something else in that garden bed, because it's good to rotate your crops and not have the same crops in each bed every season. It's also good to plant similar crops together, which is known as companion planting. And so on your planting records page, you can keep track of the plants that do well together and the beds that you had them in each season, so that you can rotate those season after season. So if you'd like to check it out, be sure to click on the link below and you can get yours too. And don't worry if you've never kept good records in the past, just start now, because as the years go by and you continue adding to those notes and records, each season is going to get better and better. And if you haven't started, your next best time to start is now. But if you did happen to grow a garden this last year, whether it was this last fall or this last spring, and you do remember anything, go ahead and write those notes down. Was there a certain variety of anything that was your absolute favorite? Do you remember planting anything that didn't really grow that well? Or did you try anything new, such as direct sowing your seeds versus transplanting? Any kind of notes like that is valuable information. So as you think over previous gardening seasons and plan out for this upcoming season, one of the really important things to keep in mind is whether or not you're going to direct sow your seeds or transplant them. There are some vegetables that should always be directly sown by seed, whereas there are other vegetables that should always be transplanted. And so if you know you're going to transplant some vegetables this season, be sure to head to my video right here, where I share my 5 best tips for transplanting seedlings so that your vegetables get their best start possible in the garden and you can have the most successful season yet. I will see you there.